Have you ever felt like you've reached the end of the line? As if everything you tried to build has crumbled before your eyes. As if every step forward is swallowed by an invisible void that insists on pulling you back. If you've ever thought that your failures define who you are, then maybe this story has reached you for a reason. And perhaps it arrived at just the right time. Michael was there, sitting in the back seat of the old car he inherited from his father. The right window no longer rolled up. The car's ceiling bore signs of moisture, and the sound of rain hitting the windshield was the only soundtrack to his life at that moment. He stared at his own reflection in the rearview mirror, searching for someone he no longer recognized. Another interview. Another closed door. Another, "We appreciate your interest, but we've decided to go with another candidate." The third no that week. The eighth that month. It felt as if the world had decided he wasn't enough. At 34, Michael had no job, no longer owned a home, no longer had a marriage, and perhaps most painfully, no longer had hope. He had once been called promising, talented, visionary. He had a small company that seemed poised for rapid growth, but it grew too much too fast and collapsed. He lost money, friends, and faith in people. And with the end of the business came the end of his marriage. The woman he dreamed of growing old with decided to move on without him. Her silence hurt more than any harsh word. After that, every attempt to start over seemed just another reminder that things wouldn't return to how they were. Michael began to accept the idea that maybe he was just a moving mistake. The kind of person who tries and fails. The kind of person others look at with compassion disguised as indifference. The kind of person even God watches from afar and sighs. But there, on that gray afternoon, something different happened. He closed his eyes and said in an almost inaudible voice, "God, just hear me this time." That was it. No long prayer, no speech, no demands, just a sentence. A sentence from an exhausted man who had no more arguments, no strength, no script. And for some reason he couldn't explain, a silent peace began to fill that car. Sometimes our transformation begins not with shouts, but with the echo of a whispered word. Not with explanations, but with surrender. And perhaps that's when God decides to rewrite the story. Not when you still have everything, but when all that's left is an open heart. Michael returned home that night in silence. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't check his phone. He just sat on the living room floor, leaning against the wall, and stayed there for hours. It was as if he was waiting for something. Or maybe just learning to listen. Because there are moments when it's not logic that saves us, but surrender. When there's nothing left to say, God speaks. When there's no way to walk, carries. Have you ever experienced a moment like that? Have you ever had to let go of your plans, your certainties, your reasoning, just to see the invisible start to happen? If you've been through that, or if you're living through that silence that feels like the end right now, share in the comments a word that represents this moment. It could be hope, change, faith, or even I don't know. Sometimes all we need is to start with one word. The next day started like any other. Cloudy skies, lukewarm coffee, and the repetitive sounds of neighbors who seemed to live in a completely different rhythm than his own. But inside Michael, something had shifted. It wasn't quite hope. Felt more like a pause. A truce between him and his own thoughts. For the first time in months, he didn't wake up blaming himself. And maybe, just maybe, that was already the beginning of something. Michael went out for a walk. No destination. Just followed his steps down old streets of the city. Places he knew well. But as he passed by a small park where he used to play as a child, something caught his eye. On one of the wooden benches, there was a small piece of paper taped down. The wind tried to pull it loose, but it stayed. Michael approached out of curiosity. On the paper it read, "Do not be afraid. I'm still writing your story. God." For a few seconds he froze. Was that for him? Coincidence? A fluke? He laughed nervously, like someone trying to shake off the weight of something too powerful to ignore. But deep down he knew. That was an answer. And not an answer to some perfect prayer. It was a response to a tired whisper. A response to someone who had only said, "Hear me." He sat down on that very bench and looked up at the cloudy sky. And he thought, if God is still writing, then maybe I'm not at the end. Maybe I'm just between chapters. That little phrase kept echoing inside him. And what would he do with it? It was too soon to know. But something in Michael started to align. As if his heart, mind, and faith were finally speaking the same language. That evening he made a decision. He would walk into the first church he found open. He didn't know if he'd be welcomed. He didn't know if he'd be judged. But he knew he had to try. He walked 3 more blocks and came across a small church, wooden doors and dim lights. A sign on the door said there would be a service at 7 p.m. It was only 15 minutes away. Michael walked in, sat in the back. The room was small but warm. No one asked what he did, where he came from, or why he was there. An older man passed by and simply smiled at him with a look that said, "Make yourself at home. This place is yours too." The pastor stepped up to the pulpit with a worn-out Bible in his hands and started preaching about new beginnings. He told the story of Moses, a man who spent 40 years in the desert thinking his failures had disqualified him. But it was in that very desert that God prepared him to lead an entire nation to freedom. Michael felt his eyes fill with tears. That message was for him. About all those years he thought were wasted, when in truth, they were shaping him. The pastor said, "If you think your failure ended your story, maybe God's just waiting for you to hand him the pen." Michael didn't know whether to cry or smile. It felt like that night had been waiting for him all along. Waiting for him to say yes. Waiting for him to let go of control, to stop needing answers. Just to trust. If you've ever felt something like this, a moment when everything seems to line up, even if you don't understand why, drop a comment below that says, "I felt that." Because when you share your journey, it might just become someone else's turning point too. That night, Michael returned home feeling different. The streetlights still looked the same. The path was still familiar. The apartment was still empty. But something inside him had shifted. It was like a huge weight had been lifted off his chest. He didn't have a clear answer, he didn't have a plan. He didn't have any promises of immediate change. But he had peace. And that was more than he ever expected. In the days that followed, without anyone telling him to, without any set routine, he started doing something he hadn't done in a long time: opening the Bible. He found that old copy his grandmother had given him when he was a teenager. He turned its pages slowly, like someone reconnecting with a treasured memory. The first few days were strange. He read without fully understanding, but he kept going. Until one quiet morning, something jumped off the page. It read, "Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in Him and He will act." Psalm 37 verse 5. Michael read that verse 3 times. Commit, trust, He will act. Those words felt alive. And for the first time, he realized he had spent years trying to control everything. Trying to fix things with logic, with his experience, with his own strength. And the more he tried, the more lost he felt. He started writing down thoughts in an old notebook. Simple, yet powerful phrases that touched his heart. He wrote, "Failure is not identity." Then, "God doesn't build with perfect victories, but with surrendered hearts." And later, "Even if I messed up, I can still start again." Those little notes became a kind of refuge. The word that once felt distant now gently confronted him, as if saying, "I never left you. I was just waiting for you to let me in." And that's exactly how he felt. Not someone who needed to pretend to be strong, but someone who could admit his weakness and find in it a new beginning. One morning, Michael decided to go back to that church. He arrived early and asked if he could help with anything. They pointed him to the rows of pews, asking if he'd be willing to wipe them down before service. He didn't mind. In fact, he was grateful. With every swipe of the cloth, it felt like he was cleaning not just the pews, but old heavy layers from his own soul. It was as if God was teaching him that there's no such thing as a small task when done with a willing heart. His days began to feel lighter, not because the problems had vanished, but because he was no longer carrying them alone. And the more involved he became, the more he realized that what held him up now was something different. It wasn't about results or outcomes. It was presence. The presence of God, quietly restoring parts of him he didn't even know were broken. Maybe you're also in a season of life where everything seems still, where nothing on the outside appears to be moving. But what about inside? Could something already be shifting in silence? If you feel like your faith is slowly starting to breathe again, write down a phrase in the comments that you feel God has been speaking to your heart. It can be short. Sometimes a single word is all it takes for the miracle to begin. What impressed Michael most during this new season wasn't the absence of problems. They were still there. Bills kept coming. His resume still hadn't gotten responses, and the fridge was often emptier than he wished. But there was one huge difference now. He was no longer alone. And more than that, he knew he wasn't. The faith that once felt like a distant memory had now become solid ground beneath his feet. He began serving more and more at the church, always behind the scenes, setting up chairs, cleaning the floors, placing water at the altar. And he did all of it with a joy he couldn't explain. One day the pastor approached him and said, "Michael, your presence changes the atmosphere here." Those words hit deep, because for so long Michael had felt useless, disposable. And now, with no status, no title, no position, he was becoming an instrument in God's hands. One afternoon, a ministry leader invited him to help with a church outreach project. They would visit a struggling community and distribute food and clothing. Michael accepted without hesitation. Helping those people, looking into the eyes of others who carried pain, was like seeing pieces of himself reflected all around. Simple people, hurting, but still with a spark in their eyes. It was as if God was using Michael's pain to connect him with other wounded hearts. And in that place of compassion, purpose was born. Not long after that, the pastor called him in for a talk. He said the church needed someone to lead a support group for people trying to start over after failure or trauma. Michael hesitated. "Me? But I'm exactly that broken guy." The pastor smiled and replied, "Exactly. Because the ones who've walked through the valley know how to guide others through it." Michael started leading small gatherings. People of all ages came, carrying stories marked by loss, addiction, financial ruin, heartbreak. And with every testimony, every hug, every honest word, he felt it stronger. What once seemed like the end of his life was now becoming the foundation of a mission he never imagined. One morning he got an unexpected call. A company he had applied to months ago wanted to schedule an interview. The offer wasn't grand. The pay was modest. But the environment, the company's mission, the way the interviewer spoke, everything made sense. At the end of the interview, the manager said, "What stood out in your profile wasn't what you've accomplished. It was how you talk about starting over." Michael got it. That job, that door, that moment. It wasn't random. It was an answer. An answer from a God who wastes no tears, no failure, no desert season. Because while Michael thought he was stuck, God was preparing. If you've ever asked yourself whether your pain has a purpose, consider this. What if the very pain you're facing right now is the soil where God is planting your calling? Share in the comments what you feel God might be preparing in the silence. Maybe it's an old dream, a new direction, or a healing you don't fully understand yet. Sharing your process might just be part of someone else's breakthrough. Michael was no longer the same. And it wasn't about appearances. His clothes were simple, his apartment still modest, and the daily challenges still demanded effort and faith. But inside, everything had changed. He no longer woke up with the weight of failure pressing on his chest. Now he woke up with the lightness of someone who knew, deep down, that even without seeing, he was being guided. The new job wasn't the pinnacle of what he once dreamed, but it felt tailor-made for the moment. The people, the atmosphere, the mission. Everything worked together for him to grow. More than just doing tasks, Michael was making a difference. He listened to his co-workers, offered kind words, shared stories when needed, and smiled with sincerity. And people began to notice. The most surprising part was that most of the changes had no logical explanation. Doors opened from places he hadn't even knocked. Invitations came. People drew near. And Michael knew it wasn't luck. It was care. It was the unseen taking shape. It was God behind the scenes, stitching together every thread of a new story. The weekly meetings he led began to grow. People of all backgrounds came to hear about second chances. Some stayed silent, others cried openly, but all carried wounds and held out hope. Michael didn't present himself as someone perfect, not even close. He just shared his own path. He talked about the prayer with no words, the note on the park bench, the power of scripture, and how it all began the moment he stopped trying to understand and simply decided to trust. At one of those meetings, a young woman named Lily shared, "I thought my past had erased me, but hearing your story made me realize that maybe there's still something left for me." Michael paused, then gently replied, "There is, because what God writes, neither time nor failure nor pain can erase." More and more, he understood that the places where it hurt the most were now the places where healing flowed the strongest. And the mistakes that once brought him shame had become bridges for others to find restoration. One evening, after a deeply moving meeting, Michael stepped out of the church and looked up at the starry sky. In a quiet voice he said, "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I had given up on myself." It was a simple phrase, but filled with gratitude. And as he walked home, something inside him recalled that very first prayer, whispered in desperation, sitting in that old car. It was as if God gently said, "See, I was here the whole time." Maybe you're in that waiting season right now, where everything still feels dark, where you wonder if things will ever truly change. But what if the unseen is already unfolding, right now, even without you realizing it? If this story has helped you see even a glimpse of what God might be building inside you, leave a comment that says, "I trust the unseen," because faith isn't about seeing. Faith is about moving forward, even when everything around says not to. 2 years had passed since that day when Michael, completely worn out, whispered a prayer inside a rusted car. That quiet moment of desperation that looked like the end was actually the beginning of everything. And now, sitting in front of a group of people with open hearts and hopeful eyes, he shared something that didn't come from a scripted speech, but from a road that had been walked. In his hand, he held the same old notebook where he had written down simple truths, truths that had reshaped his soul. Failure is not identity. Commit, trust. He will act. God starts stories with the very ones the world gives up on. He read those words aloud. And as he did, they landed in the hearts of those listening. Michael spoke about the bench at the park, about the first time he returned to church, about how wiping down pews had felt like wiping dust off forgotten corners of his own heart. He talked about the open doors, the job, the purpose, the faith that had grown through the ashes. But above all, he spoke about the love of a God who doesn't build castles on perfect victories, but builds real homes out of broken, surrendered hearts. His eyes weren't shining with pride, but with deep gratitude. Because he knew, if none of that had happened, the business failure, the divorce, the abandonment, the silence, he might never have found the strength that now held him steady. His failure had been the soil where God planted transformation. At the end of the meeting, a woman approached him. She held a crumpled piece of paper. On it, the words, "God is still writing your story." Michael smiled. She said she had found the note on a park bench 2 days ago. Michael closed his eyes for a moment. It was the same note, the same message. And in that instant he understood. The transformation God begins in us never ends with us. Spreads. As he walked out of the building, Michael looked up at the sky one more time. He didn't ask for anything. He simply whispered thanks. And finally understood. His failures were never the end. They were the path, the tears, the desert that made space for heaven to reach earth inside him. If you've stayed with this story until now, maybe it's because, deep down, you too are longing for a fresh start. Maybe you're tired, worn out, or feeling invisible. But God is still writing your story. And what He writes, no one can erase. So, leave a comment with one word that represents what you believe God is beginning in your life. Maybe it's healing, faith, new start, hope, or maybe something that's just now taking shape inside you. And if this story touched your heart, if something in it spoke directly to you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here you'll always find stories that remind you of something essential. Hope never dies, and God never gives up on those who are willing to start again. See you in the next video.